The city was alive with sound. Cars honked in the distance, shoes clicked on the pavement, and voices filled the air as people rushed through their day. It was a cool Friday afternoon, and the sun hung low behind the tall buildings, casting long shadows on the sidewalks. In the middle of all this, an old woman slowly walked toward a busy street corner with a violin case in her hand. Her coat was a little too big, and her shoes were worn from years of use. Her silver hair was pulled back neatly, and her eyes, though tired, looked around calmly. Some people glanced at her as she passed, but no one stopped to say anything. She moved with quiet purpose, heading for the same spot where many street performers set up their music or magic acts. When she reached the corner, she took a deep breath and placed her violin case on the ground. She opened it carefully and took out a small wooden stand, unfolding it with slow, practiced hands. Then she gently opened the case and looked at the violin inside. The instrument was old but clearly loved, with smooth, dark wood and strings that had been carefully maintained. Around her, people kept walking. Some were in a hurry, checking their phones or chatting with friends. Others slowed down a little, curious to see what this old woman would do. A man selling pretzels nearby gave her a short nod, recognizing her from past weeks. She nodded back, then looked down at her violin and picked it up. Just then, a group of teenagers walked by. They were loud, laughing and joking among themselves. One of them, a boy wearing a red hoodie, noticed her and nudged his friend. "Look at this," he said, pointing toward the woman. "What's she gonna do? Play music from the dinosaur days?" The others laughed. They didn't mean to be cruel, but their words weren't kind either. The old woman didn't react. She had heard worse. She stood still for a moment, as if deciding whether to keep going or pack up and leave. Then she tightened her grip on the violin and turned slightly, facing the street. The teenagers, now curious, stopped a few feet away. They didn't expect much, maybe just a few squeaky notes to laugh at. More people began to notice the scene. Something about the woman's stillness, her quiet focus, made them pause. Someone stopped scrolling on their phone. Another person turned off their music to listen. The old woman raised the violin to her shoulder and placed the bow against the strings. Everything seemed to slow down. No one knew yet what was about to happen. They didn't know who she was or what story she carried. They just knew that something about this moment felt different, and without realizing it, the crowd began to wait, silent and curious, as the first note began to rise into the air. The group of teenagers stood at the edge of the growing crowd, watching the old woman as she prepared to play. They didn't expect much. They were just looking for something to do, something to laugh at. Danny, the tallest among them, crossed his arms and smirked. "She probably hasn't played that thing in years," he said, loud enough for his friends to hear. His friend Marcus chuckled. "Bet she can't even hold a note without shaking." The others laughed along, not because they were mean by nature, but because it seemed like a harmless joke. They were used to making fun of things they didn't understand. None of them knew anything about violins. They didn't know who the woman was. To them, she was just another stranger on the street, trying to perform for change. Danny pulled out his phone and started recording. "Let's see what kind of music this granny's got," he said, trying to sound tough. He wasn't trying to hurt her, just entertain his followers. But his words carried a sting, and a few people nearby turned to glance at him with frowns. The old woman didn't look at them. She seemed focused on her violin, gently tuning the strings, her fingers moving with care. She looked calm, even though their voices could be heard clearly. She had been through worse in life. A few rude teenagers weren't enough to shake her now. Suddenly, Danny got an idea. "I dare you," he said to Marcus. "Go up there and ask her to play something. Something fast. See if she can keep up." Marcus hesitated, but the group's laughter pushed him forward. He walked up to the woman and gave a little bow, pretending to be polite. "Ma'am," he said in a fake sweet voice, "can you play something quick? Like real quick? Let's see those fingers fly." She looked up at him for the first time. Her eyes were quiet but sharp. There was no anger in them, just a long silence. Marcus stood still, suddenly unsure of what to say. The way she looked at him made him feel like she had seen through him completely. Then, without a word, she raised her bow and placed it on the strings. The crowd hushed. The teenagers leaned in. Even Danny lowered his phone slightly, not sure what to expect anymore. It felt like the whole street had stopped to listen. The old woman took one breath, just one, and then she began to play. The first few notes were soft and slow, like the beginning of a story. People expected her to struggle, but her hands moved smoothly, as if the violin was part of her. And then the music picked up speed. Fast, sharp notes filled the air, bouncing off the buildings, racing through the crowd. Eyes widened, mouths opened in surprise. The boys looked at each other, suddenly quiet. No one was laughing now. What had started as a dare was turning into something no one had seen coming. The music swirled in the air, fast and full of life. It was as if the violin itself had come alive, and every note seemed to reach into the heart of the crowd. The sound echoed off the nearby buildings and bounced across the street, grabbing the attention of everyone nearby. People who had been rushing past now stopped in their tracks, drawn in by the beauty of the performance. The teenagers, who had been so sure of themselves just moments ago, stood in stunned silence. Danny, who had been recording her with his phone, now held the camera in his hand, forgotten. Marcus, who had dared her to play something quick, stood frozen, his mouth slightly open, as if the music had somehow taken away his words. The crowd was quiet, completely absorbed in the sound. The old woman's fingers danced on the strings, moving with grace and precision. Each note seemed to tell a story, like the melody itself was alive, carrying emotions that no one could ignore. Her movements were so natural, so fluid, that it was hard to believe she was an older woman, standing in front of a crowd of strangers. She played with such passion that it was clear she had lived a lifetime with this violin in her hands. Some in the crowd whispered to each other, exchanging glances of disbelief. "She's good," one man said quietly, as though not wanting to disturb the moment. "No, she's amazing," another person replied, their voice filled with awe. The music didn't just sound good, it sounded magical, as though each note had been crafted for this very moment. The teenagers shifted on their feet, feeling a mix of guilt and surprise. They hadn't expected this. They hadn't expected her to be so good, so skilled, so full of life. They had thought they were just having fun, but now they realized they had made a mistake. The woman wasn't someone to mock. She was someone to admire. The speed of the music increased. Her bow flew across the strings with such precision that it was almost hard to follow. The crowd leaned in closer, captivated by the way her hands seemed to move effortlessly. It was as if she had been born with the violin, as if they were one and the same. Every note flowed into the next, building in intensity, until the sound filled every corner of the street. In the midst of all this, the old woman didn't seem to notice the attention she had gathered. She wasn't performing for anyone's approval. She was playing because that's what she had always done, because it was a part of her soul. She played with such confidence that the crowd couldn't help but be moved. As the last note rang out, the music lingered in the air for a moment, before fading away completely. The street was still. No one spoke for a few seconds. Then, one by one, people began to clap. At first it was just a few, then more joined in. The sound grew, and soon the entire crowd was applauding, some even cheering. The teenagers stood there, unsure of what to do, but they too joined in, their claps quieter than the others, filled with respect and admiration. The old woman smiled softly but didn't say anything. She simply lowered her violin and packed it away, her movements slow and deliberate. She didn't need words. The music had said everything for her. As the last applause slowly faded, the crowd began to disperse. But some people lingered, still processing what they had just witnessed. A few stood silently, exchanging quiet words with each other, while others took one last look at the old woman before walking away. The street corner, once full of noise and movement, seemed different now, more still, more thoughtful. The old woman carefully closed the violin case and stood up. Her movements were slow, but they carried a quiet strength. She took a moment to look at the crowd, her eyes scanning the faces of the people who had stopped to watch her. She didn't seem interested in the attention. Instead, there was a peacefulness in her gaze, as though she had shared something important, something meaningful, without needing anything in return. Nearby, a man in his 50s stepped forward. He had been watching the performance from a distance, his arms crossed. His eyes were a little red, and he cleared his throat as if trying to find the right words. "That was extraordinary," he said, his voice thick with emotion. You played Rachmaninoff, didn't you?" he asked, his face filled with both awe and disbelief. The old woman nodded slightly, acknowledging his words without speaking. She didn't need to explain the music. The man's eyes widened. "I used to hear that music when I was younger. My mother, she loved it." He paused for a moment, his voice trailing off. The crowd had thinned, but those who remained were still captivated, listening to the quiet exchange. "I haven't heard it played like that in years." He stepped closer, his voice now more personal. "My mother passed away a long time ago," he said softly. "But hearing you play, it brought all those memories back. I thought I had forgotten. But your music—" He shook his head, unable to finish the sentence. The woman didn't say anything, but her eyes softened. The man stood there for a moment longer, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a few crumpled bills. "This is for you," he said, holding them out. The woman hesitated, then gently shook her head, refusing. She didn't need money. Not for this. The man looked a little taken aback, but he understood. After a moment of silence, he simply nodded and placed the money back in his pocket. The crowd had now completely cleared, except for a few people still standing nearby, watching the old woman as she prepared to leave. A young woman, who had been watching the entire performance, stepped forward. She was in her 20s, and she seemed unsure of what to say. "I don't know if you'll remember me," she said, her voice quiet, "but I saw you play years ago, at a concert hall. I was just a little girl back then, but your music, it changed me." Her eyes were a little misty. "I never thought I'd see you again." The old woman gave her a gentle smile, but she didn't speak. The memories were there, in the music, in the faces of those who had heard her play. And that was enough. It was all she needed to know. As the last few people slowly wandered off, the old woman gathered her things and began to pack up her violin. The quiet buzz of the street returned, but the mood had shifted. People who had been walking hurriedly before now seemed to take their time, looking around with a new sense of wonder. No one had expected to witness such a powerful performance. It was as if the music had lifted the air around them, making everything feel more alive. As the woman closed her violin case, a voice called out from the crowd. "Wait!" It was a woman's voice, full of surprise and curiosity. The old woman paused, glancing over her shoulder. A woman in her 40s, wearing a green scarf, was walking toward her with a wide-eyed look. Are you Evelyn Nolan?" she asked, almost in disbelief. The old woman's face didn't change, but her hands, which had been carefully arranging the case, paused for a brief moment. She didn't speak, but there was a slight nod of recognition. The woman's eyes grew wider. "You are Evelyn Nolan," she said, her voice a little louder now, causing a few people who were still around to turn and listen. "I can't believe it. I thought you disappeared years ago. Everyone talked about you, but no one knew what happened to you." The old woman's eyes softened, but she remained quiet. The woman seemed to realize she had just spoken aloud, her hands going to her face as if she was embarrassed. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I didn't mean to. I just never thought I'd meet you. You were one of the most famous violinists in the world." She looked around, almost as if she expected others to join the conversation. But no one did. Everyone was still too stunned by the music to interrupt. The woman continued, "I remember when you stopped performing. The rumors started about a personal tragedy. And then, nothing. No one knew where you went. We thought you were gone." She paused, looking at the old woman closely. "But now, after hearing you play, it's like nothing has changed. The music is still there. You're still here." The old woman stood still, her gaze calm and steady. After a few seconds, she finally spoke, her voice soft and gentle, but filled with years of quiet strength. "I left because there was nothing left to give," she said, the words simple but heavy with meaning. "Sometimes life takes away everything you hold dear, and when it does, you have to find a new way to live. But the music never leaves. It stays with you, like an old friend." The woman who had recognized her seemed to be lost in thought. She nodded slowly, as though processing the weight of the old woman's words. "I understand," she said softly. "But why come back now? Why play here, in the street?" The old woman looked around at the quiet corner where she stood. "Sometimes," she said, "the best place to play is where no one expects you. Where the music is not for fame, not for applause, but just for the moment. For the people who need to hear it." The woman was silent for a moment. Then, without another word, she stepped back, watching the old woman with a new respect. There was no need for further explanation. The music had already said everything. And in that moment, it was enough. The crowd had mostly dispersed now, and the old woman was nearly finished packing up her violin. The street corner, which had been filled with so much life and sound only moments before, now felt peaceful, as if the music had left behind an echo in the air. People went back to their daily lives, but something in them had shifted. They walked with a little more purpose, a little more quiet appreciation for the small moments that had passed them by. Danny stood a few steps away, still holding his phone, but now it felt heavier than before. He had been so sure that mocking the old woman would be funny, but watching her play had made him feel something he hadn't expected: guilt. His fingers tightened around the phone, but he didn't look at the screen anymore. All he could think about was how wrong he had been. He turned to his friends, who had been standing off to the side, watching. Marcus still seemed a bit unsure, his eyes on the ground. The others were quiet, each one lost in their own thoughts, still processing the unexpected turn of events. Danny could see it on their faces. They all felt it too. None of them had expected her to play so beautifully, so effortlessly. None of them had expected to be moved. After a long moment, Danny started walking toward the old woman. His steps felt heavy, like he was carrying something he couldn't put down. As he got closer, the old woman looked up. Her eyes met his, calm and knowing, as if she had been waiting for this moment. Danny felt his throat tighten. He had no idea what to say, but he knew he had to say something. "Mom," he started, his voice low. I'm sorry." He paused, searching for the right words. "We didn't mean it. We didn't know who you were. We just thought it would be funny." His hands fidgeted with his phone, and he forced himself to put it in his pocket. "I didn't know you were, well, you know, so amazing." The old woman studied him for a long moment, her face gentle. She didn't seem angry, just calm, as if she had already forgiven him before he had even spoken. After a pause, she nodded slightly. "It's okay," she said softly, her voice carrying a warmth that surprised him. People often don't understand things they haven't experienced. They don't know what it takes to keep going, to hold on to something that gives meaning. She glanced down at the violin case in her hands. "It's not about being amazing. It's about the music." Danny swallowed hard, the weight of her words settling in his chest. He had never thought of it that way. To him, it had always been about being seen, about showing off. He hadn't realized that the music wasn't for them to laugh at. It was a part of her, a part of what she had lived and fought for. "Thank you," he said quietly, the words feeling small but sincere, "for playing, for showing us, for showing me what real music is." The old woman smiled faintly, a smile that was more knowing than happy. "The music is always there," she said. "It just needs to be listened to." Danny stood there for a moment longer, feeling a shift inside of him. He hadn't expected this. To learn something so important from someone he had thought was just an old woman with a violin. But here he was, learning that things weren't always what they seemed, that people had stories and lives far deeper than what could be seen at a glance. "I'll listen next time," he said, almost to himself. With that, he turned and walked away, his steps lighter than before, the echoes of the music still in his mind, a reminder of what he had learned in the most unexpected way. As the last of the crowd began to fade into the distance, the old woman stood quietly on the street corner, her violin case now closed and resting gently by her side. The sun had dipped lower in the sky, casting long, soft shadows across the pavement. The street, which had once been filled with the sounds of the city, was now almost silent. The only noise was the distant hum of cars and the occasional footsteps of someone hurrying home. The world had gone back to its usual rhythm, but the old woman seemed to carry something different within her now, a quiet sense of peace. She glanced over her shoulder one last time, as if taking in the memory of the moment. For a brief second, her gaze lingered on the spot where the crowd had gathered, where the teenagers had stood laughing, and where, just moments ago, the music had filled the air. It had been a long time since she had played like that, in front of people, letting the music speak for her. It reminded her of days long past, days when her performances were filled with applause and recognition. But now, it wasn't about that. It wasn't about fame or attention. It was about the music, the feeling, and the connection. She took a deep breath and began walking down the street, her pace slow but steady. Each step seemed measured, as if she was savoring the quietness around her. She didn't need to look back. She knew the impact she had made. The music had done its job. It had reached the hearts of those who had listened, and that was enough. As she walked, the familiar rhythm of the city returned to her ears. The honking of horns, the murmur of voices, and the hurried shuffle of feet. The world was moving fast, as it always did, but for her, it had slowed down. She had found a place for herself in it again, not as someone seeking approval, but simply as someone sharing a part of herself. That was the greatest gift she could give. A few blocks away, she stopped outside a small cafe. It was one of the places she had passed many times before, a little spot where she sometimes came for a warm drink on chilly afternoons. She had never really noticed how comforting it looked, with its simple wooden tables and chairs outside, tucked away from the rush of the streets. Today, though, she stopped and smiled softly, as if the place held a little piece of her past, a place where she could rest and reflect. She pushed open the door and stepped inside, the bell above it ringing softly as she entered. The cafe was quiet, with only a few people sitting at tables, absorbed in their own thoughts. The air smelled of freshly brewed coffee and baked pastries. The old woman walked to the counter and ordered a cup of tea. The young barista behind the counter smiled at her, not recognizing her, but offering the same polite warmth everyone received. As she took her tea and sat by the window, she looked out at the world around her, peaceful once again. She had shared her music, and now she could rest. There was no rush, no need for anything else. The world was full of noise and movement, but in this quiet corner, she was content. The music would always stay with her, and for now, that was enough. The next day, the sun rose quietly, casting its warm light over the city. It was a new day, and the streets buzzed with activity once more. People hurried along, caught in the busy rhythm of their lives. But for some, there was a small change in the air. A sense of reflection lingered from the day before, and it wasn't lost on the old woman. She had not expected to be noticed, and yet there was a subtle shift in the way the world around her felt. She had played for a reason, though she hadn't fully understood it until now. The music had connected her to something deeper, something that couldn't be seen but could be felt by anyone who took the time to listen. She had spent the night at a small inn not far from where she had played her violin. It was a humble place, but it had provided her with the peace she needed. There were no loud noises, no busy crowds, just a small room with a window that overlooked a quiet street. She had fallen asleep easily, the strains of her music still dancing in her mind. It had been a long time since she'd felt this calm, this at ease with herself. After a simple breakfast, she decided to take a walk. She wasn't sure where she was going, but she knew she needed to move, to feel the world around her. Her steps were slow, measured, as if she was savoring the morning. There was no rush, no deadline, just the freedom of being in the moment. As she wandered through the city, she passed familiar sights, shops, parks, street vendors. Nothing seemed extraordinary, but everything felt different. The city was alive, full of stories, full of people who each had their own struggles and triumphs. The old woman smiled to herself, thinking of how much life had changed, how much it had taken from her, and how much it had given back. The music was her reminder of that. It had been her companion through the hardest times, and it had carried her through moments of joy and loss. She paused in front of a small park, where children played and families gathered on benches. There was a bench near the fountain, and she decided to sit for a while. As she settled onto the bench, she watched the world unfold before her. A father tossed a ball to his son, who laughed with delight as he chased after it. An elderly woman fed pigeons near a tree. People walked by, lost in their own thoughts, but she noticed them all, each one a part of the puzzle that made up the world. The old woman closed her eyes for a moment, breathing in the fresh air. She didn't need anything more. The music would always be with her, and now, so would this moment. The calm, the peacefulness, the quiet connection to the world around her. She was no longer chasing anything. She had found her place. The music had shown her that. And now, she could simply be. After some time, she stood up and continued her walk. The city was still full of noise and movement, but for the first time in a long while, it didn't feel overwhelming. It felt just right. She had nothing left to prove. She had already shared everything that mattered. And in that, she had found the greatest gift of all, a new beginning.